Apparently, Chrissy Teigen is still apologising. She's still feeling the backlash. You said that she was on a show the other day, but she's come off social. No, she's quit her quitting of social media. She's like returned to Twitter, basically to address the people. And she was like giving it was a more heartfelt apology, talking about how she was wrong and how she was a troll and how she was doing it for shallow reasons. But at the same time, it still felt like someone was telling her what to say. It's just that she realised that first apology wasn't enough. I need to make myself sound like an like scum of the earth for people to start to forgive
She
me.
probably saw our episode of Guide.
Aye, and she was like, "Fucking hell, I need to. I can't just pretend this hasn't
Yeah,
happened."
this is too. It's going main. What am I looking for? Mainframe? No, mainstream.
Mainstream.
Mainstream. Yeah. I was like, what? Three, two, one. You've no idea how much I've been like looking forward to this week, Lewis, because I've been isolating for 3 days now. We should talk about it later,
Mhm.
but I've basically had nothing to do like Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and it's been that seems like a really short period of time, but for someone who's like just getting back to reality from like coming out of lockdown to go back into some sort of like isolation, it's been a complete nightmare.
Right, the forced isolation as well. It's a good opportunity to have a deep dive into this week's topic, though, right?
Yeah, I guess so. I'm just thankful the Euros have been on because if they hadn't, I'd have been sitting in the house just doing work, and that would have been absolutely atrocious.
No, thanks. Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm happy just to dive straight into it this week. So if you didn't know, this is Guide to the 21st Century, a conversational podcast between two friends, Lewis and I, discussing topical issues and trying to navigate the minefield that is life in the 21st century.
Yeah, that's right. Each week thus far, Scott and I have chosen a specific topic that's been in our minds throughout the week, and we basically will be bringing that to the guide, the show, and we'll be breaking down what's been kind of going through our heads, trying to disseminate our views a little bit, and the main idea is that we can reach some type of conclusion together that we probably wouldn't have been able to reach on our own.
Okay, take us away, Lewis.
So this week, I want to talk to you about these. They're called like the Canadian residential schools, which for someone that doesn't know what this topic is, will mean absolutely nothing, right?
Sure.
So basically, this actually it happened a couple of weeks ago. I think the news article actually came out on like the 4th of June, so that's two or so weeks ago. But I only found out about it just the other day. My sister actually mentioned it to me, and she was like, "That would be a pretty good topic for the guide." And I was like, "Okay, I'll take a look into it." So basically, it's this. There are these schools that have existed in Canada for the last 100 years. So this like educational system was introduced in like the late 18th century, and only just finished near the end of the 90s, like the 1980s, 1970s. And they were effectively a school, a state-run school exclusively for like Aboriginal people or people that are native to the land of Canada. And that includes quite a couple cultures. Like the main one that people are aware of is obviously the Inuits, but there's also, oh please Lewis, don't mispronounce this because it's a difficult one.
That'll get us
Oh,
cancelled right away.
yeah, I've got the Inna and I've got the Nunatukavat, and there's basically like these small like tribes that lived in Canada before it was even called Canada. And you would think that surely like a state-run school that for specific Indigenous people might make a bit of sense, but basically in the follow-up that we now having retrospective sight looking back, we realised that actually there were some horrible atrocities being committed by the Canadian government and in these schools. It's because they effectively existed to squelch all culture and tradition and upbringing from these kids in order to totally and seamlessly assimilate them into Canadian society. This is the whole point of this.
So
And I
it's just
thought,
kids from these minorities, or what I guess wouldn't have been minorities before, but are minorities now.
I think they might have always been minorities, like, because just given the environments, these weren't big towns or cities. It was very much like villages, and I think there's only like 150, 160 First Nations, which is like the initial tribes that existed there before the British moved in, before the Canadian moved in. It's also worth mentioning as well that these people, they were not willingly did not go to these schools. They were forcibly taken. Many, native parents never saw their kids again, never knew what happened about them. And the reason that it's got come up in the news is because just, as I said, 2.5 weeks ago, 215 children were found dead, buried underground, uh, in a schoolyard, and it was basically another mass grave. It turns out these things aren't actually uncommon in Canadian schools, because basically it turns out that these kids were being like really mistreated. You know, that there was like malnutrition, there was mental abuse, emotional abuse, and sexual abuse. They weren't allowed to practice their cultures, they weren't allowed to hear from home, they weren't allowed to speak their language, they weren't allowed to preach their own religion. And when I started reading about this, it was like, yeah, this is a fantastic real world example of actual colonization that we could talk about. Because just a couple episodes, episode 10 maybe?
Episode.
Got it. That was when we started talking about Kendall Jenner and how she was potentially culturally appropriating Mexican culture in order to sell this new brand of tequila. And during this episode, we started talking about the distinction between colonization and cultural appropriation. And we were saying that like, cultural appropriation is a form of colonization. And I just found it hard to wrap my head around that on an individual basis. This is very much an example of like traditional colonization, where we have a large government moving in onto like a smaller body and effectively.
This is the, when people say that cultural appropriation is colonization, this is the kind of shit that they tread on, I think, where, you know, people start wrapping in like Kendall Jenner wearing a sombrero and they call that colonization, and they're wrapping that in with this example that you just spoke about, where there's like a mass grave at a school that had like 215 children at it. And this is one of the problems with like modern day language, where people are so quick to label these new things, to misrepresent these things, and it's almost equally as dangerous to say that cultural appropriation is colonization, because it almost undermines the thing that you're about to talk about.
Exactly. That is a point that I was thinking about just when I was driving over here after work. I was like, because I was thinking back to the previous episode, and I was like, it just doesn't, like, how can you put these on a level playing field? How can you say that cultural appropriation, someone like maybe being a little bit ignorant regarding someone else's culture, can be mentioned as the same way where we have a form of cultural genocide? You know, that we have. It was absolutely crazy, but as I said, this is all relatively new, all these investigations that have been pulled into it, because it turns out only in 2010 was a report released, and it was actually funded by a small department within the Canadian government, and the department was called the Department of Truth and Reconciliation. And the idea of the study was to look back specifically at these residential schools and try and capture a holistic view of what happened, why it happened, and, like, you know, effectively the cover-ups that the Canadian government carried out. And just so to kind of recap what I've said, the preface of that document really quite nicely sums up what these schools are. So I'm just going to read it out to you right now. So Canada's okay, take two. Canada's residential school system for Aboriginal children was an education system in name only for much of its existence. These residential schools were created for the purpose of separating Aboriginal children from their families in order to minimise and weaken family ties and cultural linkages, and to indoctrinate children into a new culture, the culture of the legally dominant Euro-Christian Canadian society, led by Canada's first Prime Minister, Sir John A. Macdonald. The schools were in existence for over 100 years, and after many successive generations of children from the same communities that are enduring these schools for years and years, the experience was hidden for most of Canada's history until only recently survivors came out and they were able to find strength, courage, and support to bring their experiences to light. And as an effect of this, there have been like many lawsuits, because naturally this is a mental cover-up where people's rights were infringed. And if we can scroll down just a little bit to the introduction, just the first wee paragraph just kind of gives us a larger picture of view outside of what we're talking about, because we're just talking about these schools thus far. But for over a century, the central goals of Canada's Aboriginal policy were to eliminate Aboriginal governments, ignore Aboriginal rights, terminate the treaties, and through a process of assimilation cause Aboriginal peoples to cease to exist as distinct legal, social, cultural, religious and racial entities in Canada. The establishment and operation of residential schools were a central element to this policy, which can best be described as cultural genocide. So what this report is effectively summing up here is that you had these schools which were part of an operation that the Canadian government, for the last 100 years, which by the way is that's how long Canada's existed for, has been in place in order to squelch a native people, which is fascinating in itself. But I think we can start asking ourselves some questions about this already at this stage. It's because we, as I said, we've talked about cultural appropriation in the past. We've talked about colonization in the past. We know what happens, and this has kind of given us an idea of why it happens. But I think it might be a good idea to really answer, why did this happen? Why did the Canadian government? Because this wasn't just like one dictator. This was a body, right, that were making these rules in order to try and effectively commit a form of cultural genocide, regardless of whether, you know, the people in power thought that these were like primitives or whatever. So still very much a policy where they tried to attack these people. But before we can start speculating, one more thing to tell you, which is a little bit important, and it's basically a little bit of background about the history of these indigenous people. So back in like the 1850s, 1840s, Northern America was actually a British territory that was still owned entirely by the British Empire, and it wasn't until 1957 in which there was the act of the British North American Act, which basically made the three main counties of Montreal, somewhere and somewhere, I can't remember who the three main counties of Canada are, but they made it into Canada, and it'll be self-governing and it'll be able to do its own thing. However, a caveat of this system was that the British already had in place legacy legal obligations and contracts with the Aboriginal people, because they weren't considered British citizens. The British Empire made up a new form of citizenship for these people, which was known as sovereignship. So they like had sovereign rights. That's where that phrase comes from, and it effectively means like a people that, to be fair, we're there first, and it's officially their land. Don't get me wrong, but I've conquered it, so now it's mine. They're not British, but they were here before me, so they kind of came up with this new title, and this is where I think the problem comes in. It's because effectively now Canada has to deal with its people as well as a foreign people, even though all the people are within the Canadian land. What we know is that Canada decided that they wanted to try and eradicate these people. Why would they want to do that?
I don't immediately. I'm not sure what the reason would be, but and I want to immediately make clear that what I'm about to say is in no way a defense of this, because this seems like an atrocious act. You know, it is cultural genocide. This is. I had no idea this even happened. I had no idea this existed.
Exactly.
Seems to have been covered up very fucking well. And it sounds like one of the most horrific things I've ever heard. You know, it's up there with some of the most horrible things you've ever heard about in your life. But see if we go back to the very first episode where we spoke about the backlash that LGBTQ plus people receive when they come out. We kind of spoke about how we think there might be a biological imperative for people to think this way, because surely people aren't just bigoted for no reason. That's not a thing, right? These people must think they are doing something just.
They do it for a reason.
They must think they're doing these things for a reason. So if I look back at this and I try to put some sort of reasoning to the actions of the Canadian government at this time, maybe they thought that the Aboriginals were dangerous. Maybe they thought that the things they were practicing were inherently like dangerous, maybe to them, to the people around them. Maybe they thought they were like tribal to the point where they were maybe uncivilized, something along those lines. Where, I mean, I don't know what was going on with these tribes at the time, but maybe they were infighting. Maybe there was a lot of death. Maybe there was not a lot of acceptance of like the emergence of technology or whatever was going on. For some reason, the Canadian government must have felt that they were doing something that was bad. They were hindering Canada in some way, shape, or form, and they had to get rid of that, sort of bring them up to speed, I guess. And they thought their way was the way. You know, that seems like the only reasonable explanation as to why someone would even attempt to justify doing something as horrible as this.
Yeah, I think my initial thought was similar to that. I thought that this was like a means of control, like because
As
what
all
we've got
things
is a
are.
situation. Exactly, yeah. Because we've got the situation in which, as I mentioned earlier, we have like a conflict of interest here. It's because you have a people that aren't your citizens, but they live within your borders, and officially you have some type of obligation to care for them. But I suppose from like the fledgling Canada's perspective, these people, they weren't citizens. They were not going to be, I guess, paying tax. Like the laws that they worked under were different. And for me, what I thought was, yeah, basically, as I said, like I thought this was a means of effectively controlling this population and bringing it within their citizenship. And because in a really basic way, surely it would be a lot fucking simpler, for one thing. Instead of having to deal with two separate peoples that have two separate laws and traditions, or like land ownership and that type of thing, inheritance, it would be easier just to deal with one. So I figured it would just be a straight cut and simple idea of like, we need to get rid of these people because they're an unknown factor in our equation, and we want to make Canada as as good as we can make it.
I think that must have been a part of the equation, right? It must have been, but I think as much as it was having just one type of people was probably simpler, it was probably also these Euro-Christian people coming over and being like, our way is the way. Like, we're
Yeah,
civilized. You are
definitely. Yeah, it
not.
would be unexpected.
You
That, yeah.
need to like we need to make it so that these people are buying into this sort of thing. So
Mm-hmm.
while they are saying it's simple to have one type of people, they're also, almost more fundamentally saying the type of people we have, they're going to be our people. They're not going to be
Mm.
yours.
I actually think that this whole idea of like, these are not our people, we need to change that. I think that might have been what they sold the public. I think that was the public message, like
Mm.
these are savages, type of thing. It's because what
Oh yeah.
I think what I ended up reading was that it kind of, now I mentioned, what was the specific phrase? Oh yeah, that Canada had legal and financial obligations to the people that lived in this land. I think that's just what they wanted to snip. I couldn't figure out what those actual obligations were, but I guess I can imagine. Like for instance, if land was officially Aboriginal land, then perhaps the Canadian government would need permission to use that land or to travel through it. Or like perhaps they'd be able to charge money for using a type of Aboriginal service that exists with outside of the Canadian government. Maybe old bargains were made with the British that the new country had to withhold. For instance, just like, I don't fucking know, man.
Well,
But
it's effectively two separate countries, and they're looking at the land and they're looking at the things and the materials that they have there, and they're like, we can be using this stuff. We can colonize this area. So they're just like, yeah, we need to figure out a way to do that. And the way to do that is call this Canada, and let's just fucking get everyone into our system. Let's like force them to do it.
sure, exactly, yeah. It's because like what they could have done, which is I think to some extent what the British did when they first moved to America, was like just murder them. They could have went down that route, but I think the fact that there was already legal obligations in place, like these weren't a new people that were encountered; these were established, and the British. I'm sure the British, in 1,000 different ways, tried to shaft them over. I have absolutely no doubt about that. But they did put these laws in place so that at least there was some type of, international recognition, and they had to work around that. So what they probably, I imagine, like this government thought to themselves, like, see, in 100 years, we won't need to worry about legal obligations because there aren't going to be anyone to pay. In 100 years, I don't need to worry about Aboriginal people owning land. It's because if they're all dead, the land goes to the government, right? I think that this is like a long term goal of just like securing control.
Oh
Uh, uh,
yeah,
uh,
they very much did the colonization thing. If you're talking about mass graves and schools and things like that, they very much did murder the people. They just,
well,
but
well,
just
yeah, yeah.
the posters just said, bringing people together as one. Let's get everyone in the same culture. It was just a face that they put on for the international scene, because I feel like especially after, surely these countries were like, it was starting to become the case where they were fighting back against like control. When you think about because the American like Civil War was like before this. You know, the world was kind of like progressing to the stage where surely the planet was like no longer accepting people just coming into some, like, think about
Right.
in
Yeah. Yeah.
today's
Yeah.
society, for example, if a country was to just take over another country, there would be like repercussions for that, you would think, or at least
Yeah.
it would
Sure.
be hidden, you know, to the point where the world didn't know about it or something. But
Mhm.
back then, you know, when the British Empire was colonizing, they were just fucking openly doing it. And but as the world has kind of progressed, it's sort of been like, oh, you can't actually do that. So this was just
Yeah.
that generation's version of colonization, but they put a slap up poster on the wall and they said, no, we're not actually doing colonization, we're trying to do assimilation here, but behind the scenes we're just fucking killing them.
Yeah, yeah. There's behind the scenes. There's absolutely no difference between those two
No.
terms in the way that they're being affected here. And you're right. I think that's a good point. Like the way they went about it was almost like more insidious than just killing them all. It's because like this is a long-term plan of stripping a people of culture, tradition, heritage, and values. You know, like here's a fucking law. This was actually introduced while the British were in charge. So this is actually before Canada. So I said like the British were probably trying to fucking screw them over. They were trying to screw them over. And it was called the Civilization of Indian Tribes Act. And the idea was that if you are a native person to Canada and you're able to teach yourself how to read and write, and if you read between the lines, act white, because British was white back then, just act like the rest of them, then basically you could get free Canadian or British at the time citizenship, and like it was sold as being a really good deal. So it's like you get a juror, you can go to trial, you can like buy land in Canada type of thing, and it was like sold. But like the catch was that you had to give up Aboriginal citizenship, and once you did that, you give up your property to you give up your right to own Aboriginal land. So like the government was effectively putting in like mandatory social constructs that pushed people towards assimilation without them even knowing it was happening, or so like obviously there was like pushback when this law was introduced, as you can fucking imagine, but like we just said there, I have a funny feeling that like these tribes had such a small voice, and we were living in such a different world where back then I'm sure a lot of people did think of like Inuit tribes. They were like, oh, a bunch of idiots that don't know what, you don't know how to read or write. They were just thought they were idiots as opposed to uneducated type of thing, so it's mental. It's because see, when you think about it, what we have here is a scenario from like day one of Canada's founding. That system was designed for one people. It was not designed to facilitate two groups of people, and that's the way that the Canadians, literally the founders of I guess a bunch of really rich people in a room one day were signing documents amongst themselves and literally passing out land ownership of hundreds of thousands of people or whatever, and they actually made the decision that they are going to pursue a future for this country that neglects Aboriginal people and pushes them towards assimilation.
Yeah.
What's crazy about that is though that we're focusing on schools, right? We're talking about how they introduced this program where children were forcibly taken from homes and taught an education that they didn't, that's forced upon them, and it was horrible, and it was abuse and cruelties. But this was like one facet of the problem. It's because the problem is that it wasn't just the schools that was a social construct in which they pushed people towards assimilation. It was every single law that was introduced. They were building it this way with the intention of a unified Canada down the line, So they used like exclusion. Certain laws would not apply to Aboriginal people. They used inclusion, so that certain laws only applied to the Aboriginal people. Like for instance, like that one to do with like the land ownership, like that was effectively like a targeted way. They were like they deliberately didn't make welfare programs available to Aboriginal people. And that's like another subtle way of pushing people towards citizenship. They have different property rights for Aboriginal people and Canadian people. So like the way that land gets handed down from people to people, that's completely different. And that's not because the Aborigines have different rules and regulations. It's because the Canadian government doesn't recognise those and has a different set in place. And finally, you've just got the fact that we have a scenario in which we have like David and Goliath as usual, right? We've got Canada and 150 tribes. Like, who's got the negotiating power here? One of them has land. One of them wants land. It was never going to turn out well. So what I'm basically reaching with this is that we're looking at a problem that on the surface seems like a horrific set of schools, but it turns out it's actually a deeply systemic problem where an entire society has been written to exclude a native people.
Mm-hmm.
And this is Canada we're talking about. Fucking Canada.
Yeah.
That was it, to some extent completely blew my mind, especially because, like, you know, when you think about Canada, you think it being like the you know, one of the nicest places on earth. See, now that I've talked to you about that, I know I have an opinion on this. Do you kind of get the feeling that this is kind of a cover-up? Like, we know that the state was involved. We know the government was involved. We know the school system was involved. And I forgot to mention to you, the church were heavily involved. So of the of the 70 Canadian dioceses, which apparently is some type of religious rank, 16 of them were directly involved with the implementation of these churches. So we've got church, state, and schools all working at this. And like every single year, Justin Trudeau's like, we found another 200 of them. Oh, so fucking surprised. Really?
Yeah. Yeah. I can't believe that I've never heard about this, and it sort of makes me wonder how many other places in the world have this sort of thing. Has this sort of thing like happened? Like, didn't the British Empire own like 3/4 of the world at one point? Didn't it? It was like a crazy amount of the world that it like controlled. And see, if you look at a country like Britain going over to like America where the natives stay, or going over to Canada, there probably was a lot of things that they could have brought to benefit those cultures. You know, when I think about the Aboriginals and things like that, the technology that they had was probably nowhere near what the British had. The British probably had technology that was way beyond anything that they had even scarcely imagined.
Could imagine, yeah, exactly.
Which was probably half the problem, because the Aboriginals probably seen that technology and they were like, oh, like, keep that away from us, sort of thing. So possibly. I bet there was a lot of like rejection to that culture as well, where it was like, we just want to do our own thing, like just do your own thing. And I would probably assume that the Aboriginals probably did a lot of that, where it was like, we don't want this, like, just stay on your side of that line, sort of thing. Like, once they came here and forced their way in, it was like, right, just stay on that side of the line. And then the British probably just escalated to the point where they were just actually indoctrinating them and colonising them into their society, because they just didn't want to do it, sort of thing. And the British were like, well, we could have all this stuff, but we can't just go in and murder them now, because that's frowned upon in the world, you know?
Yeah, we made the rules to stop people doing that.
Exactly. But they're like, how do we do this in a way that makes it look like we're actually doing something good to the people here? Like, we're offering them citizenship, and it's like, well,
right, yeah,
maybe they fucking don't want citizenship, and it's like, oh, we're going to lock these things away unless they get citizenship. And it's like, hold on a second, you know, they just kind of came here, imposed their own rules, and done so in a way that's like, we're actually helping the people that are here, when they probably could have helped them, you know, but they had no right to the land there. They just turned up, took the things that they wanted, and tried to sell them it almost, you know?
Yeah, sell it right back to them. I do think to myself, I've thought to myself about that before. I'm not really come to a good conclusion about how much good, like, you know, colonizing forces like the British Empire did compared to the bad. It's because you're right. I'm sure that, like, there would have been trickle down effects, right? You would have imagined that these places, you know, they'll have maybe like telecommunications being built there, and maybe it's only the British using it at the beginning, but you'd like to think that'll trickle down to the rest of the population, and like automobiles and like all the fancy tech and like democracy, and, you know, like the Aborigines, I'm sure they didn't. Well, I don't know actually, but I don't know how established their legal system was before the British came in and were like, shit, well, we need a legal system to understand you, so they wrote it down, type of thing for them.
Yeah,
I'm not too sure about that. So there does seem like there's good points, but like my main understanding of what the British Empire did when it controlled these countries was literally just asset stripping.
Yeah,
I think they moved into a country and they took everything they could. And to me, this whole like concept of assimilation is just like a means for further asset stripping. It's like there are people here that we can't kill. They have things that we want. So how are we going to get them in the end? It's because this land is just like, we need to send this back to London. You know, the Queen needs to fucking get her hands on all this. And this is where they came up with these crazy, incredibly complex plans about how to imagine the company, the future of a country over like many decades. I don't even, yeah. In a way, I find it's how good the British got at asset stripping. You know, they'd done it for like hundreds of previous countries, and when it came to Canada, this wasn't fucking a new thing. You know, they know exactly how to do this. We can't go in and just kill them all. Maybe there's going to be some recoil or backlash. Tell you what, we can get this done in 50 years if you follow this plan. And first things first, we're going to have to introduce a bunch of laws that make it fucking terrible to be a native, not to be a citizen. So it's like it's effectively strong arming them. Excuse me. So we're both obviously in agreement. This is like horrible and evil. Do you think that can be undone? It's been 100 years now.
That was the first thing. That was the immediately as soon as you started talking about this, I started thinking about punishment. And
right, okay.
The people that that enacted this, they're not alive anymore.
They're dead. Yeah,
they're all dead. I think there are, obviously there are like a subsection of like racist people out there that still exist. Like you're talking about like you and I live in Scotland, for example. What about the white people that live in Canada now, who have been there for like a few generations now since the start of this, and they've got their homes there? It's like, should they be punished for this? And I'm like,
yeah,
those people don't have any blame in what's happened. They've just been born into this sort of like society that inherently privileged them, which is what, and we're almost coming into like this conversation about white privilege. We're talking about like white privilege in these countries, and it's one that I'm not really sure how to combat, because without giving up things that are just yours, how do you combat like white privilege? And I think a lot of people are really quick to say that you should be doing your best to combat white privilege. But in order to do that, like you talk about, example, the high-paying jobs. If you have a high-paying job and a minority doesn't have it, it's like, well, you just give up your job because you've worked hard for that as well. And it's like
really
how do you do this? I don't understand how to punish this. I don't understand how to rectify it. And I think that's a really difficult discussion that people are like really struggling with just now. Where people are like, well, there should be some sort of punishment, and it's like, well, I didn't fucking do this, so why should I punish for it?
Why the hell are you going to put? Yeah, like we're talking about like reformations type of thing. It's like how is that really going to solve anything? It doesn't make sense to me.
How can we solve these injustices? When I think about like these like Aboriginals, I think about Jewish people who must have suffered huge setbacks during like World War II, and I'm like,
through all of Jewish history, it seems like.
Exactly. How do you go back and like rectify? I just don't think you can. I don't think like maybe all that we can do now is look forward and be like, we need to make sure this shit doesn't, like, learn from the past, make sure this doesn't happen again. And there's something to be said for these people that are shouting about cultural appropriation. It's like, we shouldn't be squashing these things. Let's try and look forward morally and be thinking about how we should advance. Because I don't think there's any way we can look back and fix these things, rectify them.
Well, yeah, there's 2 points here, I suppose. Like, because you're right. Clearly, this is a gross injustice. This affected thousands of people. As I said, like 150,000 school kids went to these schools. In 2010, there were 3,000 confirmed bodies that had been found. Now in 2015, that was up to like 6,000. So there's like a couple hundred new dead children being found every single year. It's brutal. You can't even imagine. So it's like, you're right. You do kind of want someone to be punished, but when I was like reading this subject, there wasn't really calls for punishment in that regard. It's because you're right. There's who the hell would you punish? It doesn't make sense in this situation to try and punish a certain party. What instead the proposed solution? Well, I'll just tell you the solution first. The proposed solution is to effectively de-assimilate these people. And the way that you go around doing that is effectively rebuilding the infrastructure available to them that was effectively made unavailable due to these systemic problems that have been in place due to like legal systems and the school systems over the years.
Mm-hmm.
So when we're talking about rebuilding infrastructure, we mean like establishing for the Aboriginal people like trade and commerce, so they have equal opportunities. They want them to like force. They want them to encourage like traditional exports, food, which includes like food, furniture, and clothes. That's another one. We're talking about them establishing their own justice systems, about coming up with their own education systems, their own healthcare systems, their own governments. What people are talking about is just making the Aboriginal people their own country. How, like, I don't see how in this scenario the problem of there being a conflict of interest has been addressed in any way. Like, it's still relying on the people that have the power to give away this power for nothing at the expense of the people that already live in Canada, right?
Is he talking about like migrating parts of the Canadian population, like white parts of the Canadian population, into like other areas so that Aboriginals can have like space?
No. It was more nebulous. Let's build the
Ah,
infrastructure.
right.
You know?
So it was more like they're here. Let's give them a network so that they can do their thing. You know.
Well, basically, the solution makes some sense. It's because it's addressing the problems. The problems occur due to infrastructure. It's like the very basest level of society that over many, many years they've not been given opportunity to like legislation that other people would have, and as a result, things have flourished. For instance, like they've not had any opportunity to make their own healthcare system, and that's due to 100 different reasons. So the idea is that that's been taken from them. It should now be given to them.
Mm-hmm.
It makes sense in theory. It's just, in my mind, 100% impossible. You know,
It does,
because
it
like
does sound
Canada,
possible.
I'm sure Canada would rather have another hospital in Montreal. You know, instead of building one, I guess presumably on Aboriginal land. I'm kind of assuming that like some of the things we're talking about here, like how do you set up trade for a people? These are questions that like these are like things that are built naturally, and as the size gets bigger, you know, laws are introduced. For me, it seems like the damage has been done.
Oh yeah.
Their culture is irrevocably damaged.
It seems like in order
So
to dissimulate it, you'd have to basically have two sets of rules for different people within the country. Like I can only assume that the Canadian government wouldn't hand over every single power, you know, because, and this is an extreme example, okay, and I'm not saying this is something that they would do, but let's say, for example, the Aboriginal people say that there are some crimes that you can commit that justify someone killing you. You know,
okay.
like imagine, I'm not saying that they would do that or that was what they were like or whatever, but imagine
sure.
if the Aboriginal culture was turning and say, if someone steals something from you, you can like attack them physically. Then you'd have like people in Canada's streets, like Aboriginal people who were like legally allowed to like hurt people, you know, attack them if they stole something from them. And there's like quote unquote white police roaming around,
Yeah.
not able to do anything about it. You know what I mean? So like it seems like they could instill like their own justice system, and then that would be separate from the white justice system, and then they would act separately like that. They're not going to do that. Like Canada,
No.
the Canadian government is never going to fully dissimulate unless they were to give them a chunk of land and be like,
Literally say that's your country.
that's yours. Yeah. Like go do what you will with it. Like live there. They can't have like a nebulous network inside a country that's like two separate systems. That's never going to happen, because then you get a white man who steals something from an Aboriginal person, and is that Aboriginal person allowed to go and like attack them, or
what law should they
interpret? Like exactly. So
yeah,
those things, and again, that's an extreme example. I'm not saying that they would do that.
It's a good example.
It's just
though.
an
Yeah,
example.
Yeah.
Aye.
Yeah, exactly. That's the thing about me, like, because like we're not talking about territories here. It's just it's such a. You never think about how difficult this question is. The idea of having two separate people inhabiting the same land. It's like it's something I'd never thought of before. And this is the type of shit you end up with. You come up with people trying to extinguish them in some way because the problems become so difficult to deal with. It almost feels like when I was reading about this, I thought to myself, like, fucking surely the best thing to do now would just be like give them all Canadian citizenship. Then I was like, that's fucking assimilating them. You know, like that's the exact last thing they want to happen right now, is because then they'd be forcing culture straight onto them. So I was like, to me, the obvious solution would just try to like treat everyone equally.
Wait,
But
so the Aboriginals don't even have Canadian citizenship now?
uh, okay, they do have Canadian citizenship now, but I think from what I seem to understand, the fact of the reality is that they are not equal citizens in Canada. Like, as I said, these laws have been enacted for hundreds of, well, like 100 years, and every single one of them was enacted bearing in mind that Aboriginals are different from Canadians. So as much as on paper, right, they are both citizens and they can both buy land and stuff like that, there are 100 different nuanced ways in which it is unfair. And like the Canadian government actually has tried to address this, is because there's an act that was formed, I think, basically like at the birth of Canada, and it's called the Indian Act, because they were referred to as like Red Indians, and it was basically an act which dictates how the Canadian government and the Indian tribes, the First Nation tribes, have to interact with each other. And the thing is, like, before this, treaties existed that were negotiated between the two people, but Canada was like, no, we're making an act. An act is like unanimous and unilateral. You need to follow this. Um,
And the act was?
yes, the Indian Act. Yeah, that's what I just mentioned. Sorry, like this act basically was telling people how they should act towards each other in one way or another. That basically was the overall framework of this act, and it still exists today. But since 2020, there's been 5 major overhauls of this one act to
Right.
try and address problems that are still seen in
Right.
Canadian culture. Like it's very much an ongoing thing, and it's this is what I'm trying to say. It's like such a tangled issue that it's it's sure these days, like they are both citizens, but it's just the reality is there are differences between the two of them, and trying to just make it a blanket the same and just say that, let's drop every mention of Aboriginal in all of our documentation. That's just as bad as committing cultural genocide, right? Because you're
Sure.
effectively claiming they don't exist. So it's almost like a self-perpetuating problem. The government needs to come up with new policies which address the fact that Aboriginal people are different, but by addressing the fact that they're different, they're introducing more forced assimilation, and it's like this horrible self-fulfilling loop that I just don't know. I don't know how they come to a solution for this. I agree with you that I feel that there's justice is undone. I feel that the Canadian government saying, sorry, that was our bad, isn't enough. I don't see how how this can realistically be, for one, rectified, and for two, punished or forgiven.
To be honest, I kind of like look at the idea of dissimulation, not in the way that they're doing it, 'cause I don't think the way they're doing it will. You're right, it probably is impossible, but I kind of like, and I say kind of like that maybe that's the wrong phrase to use, but I can maybe see the merit in like giving them their own territories and being
Mm-hmm.
like, look, we want to undo the injustices that have happened to your people, like coming having like conversations with Aboriginal people and being like, you, because the Aboriginals obviously have like territories right now. They have like small towns and like
Yeah, they still have
cities and
land.
things
They
like
still
that.
have land.
They
Yeah.
have areas of land that is just full of Aboriginal people, where they
Mm-hmm.
kind of have their own systems in place. Obviously, I can see the merit in an idea of being like, look, you have your own territories. If they really want to dissimulate and allow them to have their culture, they are going to have to give them a section of territory and be like, okay, like take like sort of negotiate with them, be like, take this area. Um, but that again, that would involve moving people out of that territory that, white people, basically people that weren't
Yeah.
people
Yeah.
that weren't
Population.
Aboriginal.
Mm-hmm.
It would involve moving them out of those areas. So we're talking about like a transfer of land in some cases where like non-Aboriginal people would move into the Aboriginal areas and they'd move into this, and there'd be like a big transfer there. But that
Mm-hmm.
seems to be not a good solution, because I don't think that is a good solution to this. But I'm like, if you want to move forward, maybe that's somewhere to start. But I just can't imagine the Canadian government ever doing anything like that.
No, I don't think they'll ever be incentivized enough to do that. Because when we're talking about like mass migrations of people, there needs to be things for the people to move to. There needs to be houses, there needs to be fucking petrol stations and businesses that are already set up there. Need to be close to their work and their homes. Like the amount of money that it would take for Canada to set up many nations or like towns off the cuff of nothing would be astronomical.
Yeah, you can't.
And
You won't
surely,
be able to move like non-Aboriginals into an Aboriginal land like area because it'll be nothing like the culture that they live in. It would be unreasonable to ask someone to move in there without putting the infrastructure in place for
right,
them to go there. You know.
and it needs to be attractive for people to move there in the first place. Otherwise, the migration is just impossible. It's a fucking dead start because people need to, like, it needs to have like opportunities there for them, new life, that type of thing.
And it's not that one or the other's unattractive. It's just that they're attractive to their culture. You know, you like the Aboriginals live in a place that they do find attractive. But for example, you know, I don't think I'd want to go there. You know, I like where I live, like the culture that I live in right now. I wouldn't want to move into a different place or be told, you know, you to move across the country, sort of thing.
Well, I think that's even like a modern facet of assimilation, to be honest. Because, like, see, when it comes to working like a corporate job where you're in the 20th floor of an office communicating with the business over in France, it's probably not going to be happening in Aboriginal land. You know,
Yeah.
If you want to do that, you will need to leave your people and culture and go into a different culture perceived to yours, like the more what was it, the European culture, you know, and that is effectively a form of like subversive assimilation. It's because, like, if they want that job, they're just gonna have to leave. You don't have a fucking choice about it. There are no options there. That's like not even anyone's decision. That's just ramifications of decisions that have been made decades and decades and decades ago.
Yeah, I can't see any possible clean dissimulation that the Canadian government can do or
No.
are even willing to do. I think they talk a big game about dissimulation, but like in reality, that's never going to happen. Like they'll never dissimulate these cultures.
No.
The Canadian government are always going to have a form of control over the Aboriginal people now, and that's never going to go away. I don't believe that'll ever go away. So, which is sad.
Yeah, it is sad. I have a funny feeling it'll be one of those things where, like, Justin Trudeau, he's been fucking out there for 5 years now, apologising every single time he's outside because he's like, the Canadian people did a horrible thing. And they did, you know. He should be apologising. But all he's going to do is wait until the last body is found and there are no more to be found, and then he'll stop apologising for it. And then the Canadian government will continue pretending it never happened, you know. It's like, so much of their reputation in the modern age is on like democracy and like friendliness and peace and equal opportunity. This is like an ultimate black mark that they have over their name, and I think it's incredible that more people don't know about it. I fucking, as I said, I had never heard about it myself. I don't know how my sister was ended up reading about it in the end, but I need to find out, because it is the type of thing that's a real world example of one of the issues that we talk about. This is a guide to the 21st century, you know, and like we talk about colonization. You tend to think that colonization hasn't happened for a long time. This was a relatively modern example of it. A conversation for another day, I imagine, will be the cultural assimilation that's happening in China right now with the local people. Because I have a funny feeling if you and I to research it, it would be very, very similar to what we're looking at with Canada right now.
I've done a little bit of research on the Chinese about what's going on over there for like.
With the Uyghur, is that what they're called?
Well, I specifically researched a religion called Falun Gong a few years ago. And see, to be honest, see if you just Google anything about China, you can get stuck in a little rabbit hole. It's a kind of dark place.
Oh yeah, really
Seriously, like before you know it, you're on the black market and you're buying organs. That's the sort of thing you can go into in like China. China's totally mental. Just bring it back to Canada though. I just googled what percentage of Canadians are Aboriginal, and it says the first answer Google just says that 5% of Canadians self-identify as indigenous people. Now, 5%. I don't even think the government are that worried about 5%. They don't even have that big voting power. You know what I mean?
That's a big number though. Don't get me wrong. I think it's small enough for them not to worry about it. You're probably right. Yeah. But in terms of the number of people there, like a lot of people that are still being affected by this to this day.
Oh yeah, but we're talking about like dissimulation. Like the Canadian government will be looking at all of these things in terms of. They'll also have like their economy hat on. They'll be like, is this benefiting us, sort of thing? And they're looking at like 5%. They're looking at how much backlash they're really going to receive for this, because the world doesn't really seem to care. It just seems to be every once in a while a new mass grave is found and he apologises and like there's nothing really being done, so why would he do anything, sort of thing. It's probably just all to save face, you know, or we're doing dissimulation. It's like, no, you're fucking not.
Yeah, it does feel there's been some degree of damage control that's been actively being carried out through this whole thing. I swear that this is. I know, I sometimes feel this is about all, well, I was going to say British media. I'm sure it's the same for all media. You know, they very much pick and choose the events that are happening in the world that you're going to be paying attention to. I'm sure there are like horrific riots in the streets happening in certain Eastern Bloc countries for weeks and weeks recently that we'll never hear about, the same way that this was these like children that are being found year after year, month after month, continue to be small like column pieces. But yeah, man, that's what was on my mind this week, and that was a mental one, and I just did tie in quite well with previous episodes, and hopefully might even be a diving board to a future conversation we have.
Yeah, it's crazy to me that I bet if you spoke to anyone in the street, and you speak to any of your friends, this would be news to them. You know, it's not something that would be
Big
like
news, yeah.
It's not something that would be like covered. And it almost makes me think that the news like just like selectively shows you what it wants to show you. It's not, the news isn't going to be like, oh, by the way, your ancestors, they committed genocide. Like the news is never going to show you that kind of stuff because they want you to believe that we live in a good place. You know, they want to keep that element of control they have over people. They don't want to be like, oh, look at these massive injustices that have happened in the past, unless they were committed by someone else. You know?
Yeah, exactly. You know, it's okay for us to see injustices for like Israel Palestine, but like when it comes to our allies like Canada, who we trade with, and like half of fucking Scotland's population goes to retire over there, it's like no, we keep that out the news. Like, don't want people like that might affect the immigration type of thing.
Yeah, and also to be like, it's people from here that actually did it. You know, like people that
sure. yeah, exactly. Like we're forgetting that this started in the British colonialization era.
Yeah, like it might actually be your great grandfather sort of thing. You know.
Yeah, exactly. It's like it's a scary thought, and that kind of does bring it home a little bit, doesn't it? How close we are to this issue.
Yeah, I think it's one of the fundamental things that makes me like really not proud to be British. How dark the history of this country must be, you know. Even just to be like Scottish, to have like the British sort of like taking over here as well. You know,
I mean, it's the modern history of Britain is atrocious.
Oh yeah,
absolutely no doubt about it. But like, think about the empires. Think about the fucking Mongol Empire that took over half the world. Like the Mongol Empire, Alexander the Great, the Holy Roman Empire. I think they might have been talking about equivalent land masses to the British Empire. You know, like it's the most fresh in our memory. But let's not forget that every country, when they're given the right resources and like the right period throughout time, the right agriculture, they're going to be fucking tyrants, absolute tyrants. The only reason we don't live in a world full of tyrants is because everyone has such big guns, you know.
I think
scared.
I think because you're right, when we talk about like the past, there are like portions of history where certain people just like rule, and it's normally through like advancements in technology. Most of all, you know, when you think about, I guess maybe the Mongol Empire had like
it was
horseback. It was weaponry, stuff like that. But then when the Romans came around, they built the roads, stuff like that.
And tactics as well. They started like warfare on a higher level, and
you talk about like seafair, like ships and things like that. There was probably an empire that had like ships. It probably was
that was the British.
Probably
Empire,
was the British Empire, exactly.
Yeah.
So like they kind of came with travel, kind of instilling that across the world, that the guns and whatever. Like every time there's like an advancement in technology, a new section of the world kind of like takes over. But I think now the world's starting to get to a place where we can communicate with everyone, and morality is starting to become a bit more of an issue. Like, I don't think that the next big takeover we see, like you and I speak about it, we think it's probably going to be China, and it's not going to happen on the streets. Like it's going to happen.
No, it's not going to happen with like tanks, you know, outside your door, right?
Then they're not going to be like coming to your door and like shooting you or whatever. They're just going to like, it'll be all online, you know, and they'll just take over, and they'll take over that space, and they'll do the same sort of thing, and God knows what that'll look like. But
the worst part is, I genuinely think for the scenario you're gonna talk about, like, it won't look any different to us. I think we'll be reading the same headlines. It's just that they'll all be written by people in a different country, you know, or it'll all be false news or something like that. The thing about it is it'll be so undistressing to us. It'll seem like normal life.
Maybe.
But anyway, that's diving off the deep end anyway. Hopefully we won't get fucking quite that bad.
Yeah, I guess not.